He was rich, ruthless, and untouchable. She was broke, overlooked, and temporary. Maggie Blake didn't plan to stand out. She just needed a paycheck enough to cover her sister's medication and maybe keep the lights on for another week. But when she accidentally challenged the most feared CEO in New York, something shifted. Not in the company, in him. Thomas Beckett built his empire by controlling everything: numbers, people, even public opinion. But what happens when the one person he couldn't predict refuses to play along? Would you stay in the game, knowing it could break you? Would you walk away from power, or from something that almost felt like love? This isn't a love story in the way we've been taught to expect. It's a story about courage, about choosing dignity over comfort, about what happens when two broken people stop pretending and start being real. If it stirs something in you, let us know in the comments. And follow our channel for more stories that speak to the quiet strength in all of us. Now, the story begins where most romances never dare to go, with the truth. When your bank account says $27 and your pride says, keep going, you show up, no matter where you are. There was exactly $27.42 in Maggie Blake's checking account. She'd triple-checked that morning, holding her breath like the number might magically change if she stared hard enough. It didn't. She stood at the edge of 7th Avenue, her hands tucked deep into the pockets of a faded beige coat. Her heels pinched. The wind bit at her cheeks. Manhattan in early spring could still feel like winter if you were underdressed and overburdened. She wasn't sure what felt heavier, her bag with a 3-day-old banana and a tattered resume inside, or the quiet weight of knowing this wasn't where she thought she'd be at 32. A year ago, she was pitching educational tech ideas at investor meetings, drinking too much cold brew, sleeping too little, believing that passion could outrun bad luck. But then, the startup collapsed. Her co-founder disappeared, the grant funding dried up, and she was left with overdue student loans, a sister halfway through college, and a landlord who had the patience of a parking meter. So, when the agency called and offered her a 6-week temp assignment as a secretary at Beckett Industries, she didn't hesitate. She didn't have the luxury to. She walked into the glass tower at 8:01 a.m. The security guard scanned her in without looking up. The elevator music sounded like something played in expensive spas, calm, curated, and completely detached from reality. The 42nd floor felt like another planet. Every surface gleamed. Not a single desk had clutter. Everyone moved like they had somewhere far more important to be. Suits tailored to perfection, lanyards straight. Makeup minimal, but flawless. Maggie swallowed and adjusted her cardigan, suddenly conscious of the slight fray at the cuff. Her desk was tucked into a corridor just off the executive suite. The windows stretched floor to ceiling, offering a breathtaking view of the city she used to dream in. But no one looked out. They were too busy typing, talking, walking briskly like time had a price tag. She kept her head down, learned names quickly, and answered every email with the kind of cheerfulness that didn't sound fake, but didn't sound too real either. They wanted professional, not personal. She barely spoke more than 5 words to the other assistants in her first 3 days. No one was rude, they just didn't see her. Like a chair or a printer. There. Useful, forgettable, and Thomas Beckett, the CEO whose name sat in gleaming letters on the wall near reception. He hadn't appeared. Not once. But his presence, his rules, his voice on company memos, the way people straightened their backs when they passed his door, was everywhere. It was in the way no one left coffee mugs on their desks. It was in the silence that followed every meeting. The kind of silence that said, "Don't question the system." And Maggie, well, she had always had a problem with that. On the 4th day,
A mandatory department-wide meeting was called. Topic: the newly updated productivity and scheduling policy, crafted, approved, and distributed directly from Mr. Beckett's office. The room was packed, fluorescent lights buzzing, coffee cups lined up like soldiers. Midway through the presentation, Maggie frowned. On the slide was a new system requiring team members to log their hours in 15-minute increments. No flexibility, no exceptions. Managers could revoke personal time without warning. Someone in the back nodded. Someone else tapped their phone under the table. Maggie hesitated, then raised her hand. The speaker, a slim man in a navy blazer, looked surprised. He paused. "Yes," he said, reading her name tag. "Maggie." She cleared her throat. "Apologies, I'm new, but has anyone raised concerns about how this policy might affect team morale?" Heads turned. A few people blinked. Slowly, Maggie continued, her voice steady. "I mean, hourly logs down to 15 minutes. That implies you don't trust your employees to manage their own time. And revoking personal breaks. It feels, well, more like punishment than productivity." A long silence followed. Then a polite cough. The speaker gave a tight smile. "Thank you for your feedback," he said crisply, and clicked to the next slide. After the meeting, no one looked her in the eye. One assistant passed her in the hallway and whispered, "Brave." Maggie smiled tightly, heart racing. That night, she updated her resume. Again. By noon the next day, she expected her contract to be terminated. But instead, her office phone rang. It was HR. Cordial. Neutral. "Mr. Beckett would like to speak with you privately," the voice said. "Right away." Maggie stared at the receiver long after the call ended. She hadn't even seen the man yet, and now he wanted a meeting. Just her. Just him. They said he never smiled. They were right until she walked in. The office of Thomas Beckett was nothing like Maggie had imagined. It wasn't the dark, intimidating corner suite she'd pictured. No mahogany walls or roaring fireplaces. No oversized desk made to look like a throne. Instead, it was bright, sparse, too quiet. A single piece of abstract art hung on one wall, all sharp angles and bold strokes like someone had tried to paint silence. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the space, casting long morning light across polished concrete floors. The man behind the desk didn't look up when she entered. He was reading something on a tablet, his brow slightly furrowed, a pair of glasses resting on the bridge of his nose, not decorative, but functional. There was a quiet intensity in the way he sat, like a man who didn't waste time standing unless the building was on fire. Maggie waited. Seconds passed. Then he finally spoke, without looking. "Miss Blake." It wasn't a question, just a statement, a fact placed neatly on the table. "Yes, sir," she replied, standing a little straighter. He removed his glasses slowly, set them down with the precision of someone used to control. Thomas Beckett looked exactly like every photo Maggie had ever seen of him, tall, lean, well-groomed. But photos couldn't capture the stillness about him, the measured way he blinked, the weight of his gaze, the way he could say more with silence than most could with paragraphs. "You've made quite the impression." "I didn't mean to," Maggie replied honestly. For the first time, his expression shifted. Not a smile, but something in the corner of his mouth twitched, almost amused. "Almost. That's precisely why you did," he said. She waited for him to explain, unsure if she was being reprimanded or promoted. He stood and crossed to the window, hands folded behind his back. "Beckett Industries is not in the business of being liked, Miss Blake, but lately, public perception has become. more delicate. He said the word like it tasted foreign. She followed his gaze out the window, rows of gray rooftops stretching into the morning haze. "You've heard the rumors," he said, without turning. "About me." It wasn't a question. "I don't believe everything I read," she replied carefully. "Good, then you're already smarter than most of my PR team." He turned back to face her, and this time his eyes held a sharpness that made her feel like she'd just been measured, weighed, and sorted into a category she couldn't yet name. "You're not here to answer phones," he said. "Or file meeting notes. I don't need another assistant with perfect posture and no opinions." Maggie opened her mouth, but nothing came out. "You're here," he continued, "because you're ordinary." The word hit her like a slap. Her hands clenched slightly, but she held her voice steady. "Excuse me." He didn't blink. "That's not an insult. It's your value. You speak like a human, not a headline. You challenged a policy in a room where everyone else stayed silent. And you didn't do it for attention. You did it because you still think things can be better." "I do," she said slowly, "even when it's inconvenient." He nodded. "Exactly." He walked past her to a credenza and poured himself a cup of black coffee. Didn't offer her one. "I need someone the staff trusts. Someone who can communicate with warmth." The word sounded odd coming from him, like a borrowed term from a foreign language. "You want me to be your internal voice?" she asked. "I want you to be a buffer," he said bluntly, "between me and the people who think I don't care." "And do you?" she asked before she could stop herself. Thomas turned to her, cup in hand. He didn't answer right away, but the silence said enough. "It doesn't matter," he said. "What matters is that they believe I do." Maggie's throat tightened. So that was it. She wasn't being promoted. She was being positioned, rebranded, as the friendly face of a machine. A soft presence to soften a hard man. "I don't know if I'm the right person for that," she said. "You are," he said simply, "because people believe you. They don't believe me." There was something in his tone, not desperate, not pleading, but undeniably honest. And somehow that made it worse. "You're using me," she said quietly. Thomas didn't deny it. Instead, he stepped closer, setting the coffee down, eyes meeting hers with quiet gravity. "You'll be compensated accordingly. A full-time contract. Benefits. Whatever number you were hoping for, double it." Her heart stuttered. He wasn't bluffing. He didn't need to. Maggie thought of her sister, Lily, waiting tables part-time while juggling biology classes and unpaid internships. Rent was due again next week. The car needed repairs. Their mother's old piano lessons still carried a monthly loan fee they couldn't quite shake. She had sworn she wouldn't compromise her values again, not for a paycheck, not after what happened with the startup. But this wasn't selling out. This was surviving. Still, the line felt thin, too thin. "I'll think about it," she said softly. Thomas nodded once. "You have until the end of the day." He turned away, already reaching for his tablet again. The conversation, in his mind, was done. Maggie walked to the door, paused, then looked back at him, the man behind the name, behind the silence, behind the headlines. There was no kindness in his posture, no warmth in his expression. But just before she left, she thought she saw the faintest flicker of something in his eyes. Not regret, not doubt, just tiredness. In the elevator, Maggie pressed the button for the ground floor with a trembling finger. Her reflection in the mirrored wall stared back at her, uncertain. How far would she go to keep the lights on? And what would it cost her to stand so close to power without losing herself in its shadow? You don't have to like someone to learn from them, but sometimes you end up doing both. The first time Maggie rode in the back seat of Thomas Beckett's car, she noticed that silence followed him like a loyal shadow, not the heavy kind that came from discomfort. His silence was calculated neat, structured, like every word he ever spoke had first passed through 5 layers of internal editing before being allowed out into the world. Maggie wasn't used to that kind of quiet. Not after years of startup chaos, co-working spaces, and late-night pizza debates about app launches and branding pitches. That world, her world, had been loud, messy, human. Thomas Beckett was none of those things. Their first public event together was a fundraising luncheon for city school libraries, the type of event where people smiled too much and complimented each other's philanthropic commitments, all while quietly comparing stock portfolios. Maggie stood beside Thomas as he moved from handshake to handshake, his posture impeccable, his eyes alert yet distant. He didn't fumble, he didn't falter, but he didn't connect either. When a reporter asked about his recent investments in educational reform, he delivered a textbook-perfect answer. Measured, on message, uncontroversial. Yet Maggie could feel it. The room didn't warm to him. Afterward, in the car, she glanced over and found him staring out the window, fingers drumming lightly on his knee. Not nervously. Mechanically. You don't actually like those events, do you? She asked before she could stop herself. Thomas turned his head slowly. Liking isn't required. Results are, and just like that, the wall went back up. Over the following weeks, Maggie shadowed him through more events, internal briefings, nonprofit meetings, media lunches, always professional, always calm, always controlled. But the cracks showed, if you knew where to look. The way his shoulders tensed slightly before every public appearance, the way he avoided small talk in the elevator, the way he declined every after-hours drink invitation, retreating to his office long after the last assistant had gone home. Maggie began working late, too. Not to impress him, but because something inside her wanted to understand the machinery of him, of the company, of this strange new world she'd landed in. One night, just after 9 p.m., she passed the executive lounge on her way out and spotted him inside alone, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, a glass of scotch untouched beside him. He was reading a handwritten letter, not printed, not digital real pen on real paper. She paused only a second before continuing past, but something about the moment stayed with her. The stillness, the solitude, the fact that even power, when stripped of its armor, looked a lot like loneliness. That weekend, Maggie stopped by the office on a Saturday morning. She wasn't required to, no one had asked her to, but she had a hunch the internal communication site needed serious cleanup. Employee announcements hadn't been updated in weeks, and if Thomas wanted to improve morale, someone had to start with the little things. To her surprise, the security desk had a visitor signed in just before her, Jeremy Beckett. She ran into him near the elevators. He looked startled, then smiled warmly when he recognized her. "Ah, you're the new Maggie," he said. "Thomas actually mentioned you." "That's rare." She tilted her head, curious. "Good rare, or..." Jeremy chuckled. "He said you don't tolerate nonsense. That's probably the highest compliment he gives." They chatted for a moment about shared work chaos before Jeremy mentioned something that made Maggie pause. "Tell him Mom's birthday dinner is still Tuesday. Same place. Not that he'll show up." She blinked. "He's not coming." Jeremy shrugged, but the weight behind it felt heavier than indifference. "He hasn't come in 4 years. Says she wouldn't know what to say to him anyway." He offered a parting smile and stepped into the elevator. Maggie stood there for a long moment after he left. It didn't line up. The Thomas she saw at work was rigid, but capable, cold, but competent, but estranged from his own mother. That suggested wounds deeper than ambition could explain. The next Tuesday evening, after yet another press briefing, she found herself beside him again in the car. Rain dotted the windows, the world outside blurred and gray. Maggie broke the silence. "Do you ever take a day off?" Thomas didn't look at her. "I work from home on Sundays." "That's not a day off. That's just a different kind of working." He didn't answer immediately. For a second, she thought he wouldn't at all. Then, softly, not bitterly, just honestly, he said, "I don't know what I'd do with one." That landed harder than she expected. Maybe. Start with breathing, without a meeting attached. Still no response. But something in his eyes shifted. Not defensiveness, not annoyance, just quiet acknowledgement. The car pulled up to the building. They both exited. He walked toward the elevators, paused halfway, and turned back to her. "I assume you eat lunch," she blinked. "Is that an invitation?" He didn't answer.
Just looked at her for a beat longer than necessary and disappeared inside. The next morning, Maggie arrived at her desk to find a white envelope tucked neatly beside her laptop. Lunch, 12:30, Conference Room B. TB. No smiley face, no flourish, but it was unmistakably a gesture from the man who never lingered. It was almost personal. Maggie turned the card over in her fingers, wondering why a lunch invitation from the most emotionally unavailable man in Manhattan suddenly felt like the start of something important, something real. They say the camera doesn't lie, but they've never worked in corporate PR. The studio lights were blinding, not the metaphorical kind, the literal, hot bulbs aimed squarely at Thomas Beckett's face as he sat, motionless, in a straight-backed chair across from the host of Morning Focus. A small red light on the camera blinked to life. They were live. Maggie stood just off stage, barely breathing. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not officially. Her job title still read executive assistant, not on-set handler. But Thomas had asked, in that clipped, non-negotiable tone of his, be there, just in case. He never explained what in case meant, but Maggie had learned quickly. Thomas Beckett didn't waste words. And if he said he needed her present, it wasn't an empty request. The interview started easily enough. Polished questions, predictable answers. Beckett Industries has seen remarkable recovery this quarter. Your recent investment in renewable logistics, Thomas handled them well, speaking with the poise of a seasoned executive. His voice, as always, calm and measured. Every sentence delivered like a balance sheet, accurate, safe, uninspiring. Then came the turn. The host leaned forward, a practiced smile on her lips, but a gleam in her eye. "Let's talk transparency, Mr. Beckett." Earlier this year, a former department head filed a wrongful termination suit alleging a toxic work environment under your direct leadership. Thomas didn't flinch. At least, not at first. But Maggie saw it, the barely perceptible pause, the tightening of his jaw, the way his hands, always so still, began to shift against the table. He answered the question. Technically, he quoted the legal dismissal, reaffirmed the company's commitment to employee wellness, but the warmth left his voice. His tone flattened. His eyes, dark and distant, seemed to retreat into themselves. The energy in the studio shifted. The host sensed it too, smelled the vulnerability. She pressed again. "And how do you respond to critics who say Beckett Industries is more concerned with appearances than people?" Maggie felt a knot form in her stomach. The kind of knot she used to feel in meetings where investors turned skeptical.
She glanced at the stage manager. They were still live. Something had to change fast. And then, without fully thinking, she stepped forward, just enough to catch the host's eye during a momentary pause between questions. The woman looked up, slightly confused. Maggie smiled, calm, soft, natural, and gently motioned as if to indicate a note the host had missed. A non-verbal suggestion. The host raised an eyebrow. Then, in a subtle pivot, she turned her attention to Maggie, still half visible in the wings. "I understand your new communications assistant is with us today," the host said, with a knowing smile. "Would you mind joining us just for a moment?" There was a pause, a long one. Maggie could feel every pair of eyes in the room on her, including Thomas's, especially Thomas's. But something in his expression surprised her, not irritation, not command, but relief. So she stepped into the light. The chair offered was too high, the mic clipped on too fast, and her heart pounded in her ears, but Maggie Blake knew how to talk. She had built a startup from scratch, charmed investors over cold coffee, and once delivered a product demo in front of a live audience while her code crashed silently behind her. So she smiled, steady and real, and told a story. "My mother used to plant persimmon trees," she began, answering no question in particular, just gently guiding the moment away from the heat. She'd say they were stubborn. You had to be patient. For 2 years, maybe 3, they'd give you nothing but leaves. But when they did fruit, oh, they were the sweetest thing. The host leaned in, intrigued. "And what does that have to do with Beckett Industries?" Maggie glanced sideways at Thomas. His profile was still, but his eyes, those eyes softened at the edges. She turned back to the host. "Some companies and some people don't bloom on someone else's timeline. Doesn't mean they don't care. Just means they need space to grow on their own terms." The room held its breath. Then Thomas laughed. Quietly. Genuinely. It was short, but it was enough. The camera caught it, the rarest of moments, the ruthless CEO smiling. Not forced, not rehearsed, just human. The interview wrapped shortly after. The host thanked them both, and the light on the camera dimmed. The moment they were off air, Thomas stood and stepped aside with Maggie, away from the crew. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know." He studied her for a moment, eyes unreadable. Then, almost under his breath, "My mother used to make persimmon jam." Maggie blinked. "You're kidding." "No," he said. "It was terrible, but she insisted on giving it as Christmas gifts. People were too polite to complain. They both smiled. The second genuine smile in 10 minutes. A record." By the time they got back to the office, the clip had already been shared on LinkedIn, retweeted by business analysts, and added to a dozen top CEO moments lists. The head of internal communications flagged it as a golden moment of relatability. PR called Maggie the key to the turnaround. Suddenly, her inbox was flooded with meeting invites, press queries, and quick coffee chats from executives who hadn't known her name last week. And as she sat back at her desk, processing it all, she realized something unsettling. They hadn't just seen Thomas differently today, they'd started seeing her differently, too. A new light was shining on Maggie Blake, brighter than she'd asked for. And sometimes, light can burn. If something feels too real to be fake, maybe it isn't fake at all. The soft clink of glasses and the low hum of jazz floated through the rooftop air like a memory half-formed. It was a Thursday night, early spring, the kind of evening when Manhattan felt gentler, less like a machine and more like a place where people fell in love slowly, without realizing it. Maggie stood by the stone railing of the terrace, arms folded loosely, watching the lights of the city blink like sleepy eyes. She'd been at Beckett Industries for just under 3 months, long enough for routines to form, long enough for boundaries to blur. Thomas had been inside moments ago, thanking the nonprofit board for their partnership, his voice calm and composed as always. But when he stepped out onto the terrace to join her, the weight around his shoulders seemed to drop just a little. "You always look more comfortable outside than in," he said, settling beside her, "just close enough for warmth." "I don't do well in rooms where people clap too easily," Maggie replied with a small smile. "Makes me nervous." Thomas let out a quiet breath that could have been a laugh. Same. For a moment, they said nothing. They didn't need to. The conversation that followed was unlike anything they'd shared before. There were no corporate updates, no briefing notes or event schedules, just truths. Thomas spoke first. He told her about a house with no heat in the winter, about a father who drank through every paycheck, a mother who waited tables until her hands trembled at night. "My first job was washing dishes at 13, he said, eyes fixed on the skyline, not because I wanted spending money, because we needed heat. Maggie listened quietly, her throat tight. She told him about the loan she'd taken for college, how she'd signed the papers with shaking hands and no cosigner, how the financial aid office smelled like cheap paper and floor wax, and how, for years, every decision she made had been shadowed by the interest rate attached to her name. I remember walking home from my first part-time job with $23 in tips. She said, I held that money like it was sacred, like it meant I was doing okay, even when I wasn't. Their eyes met. Something flickered between them, not pity, not even shared struggle, something deeper. Recognition, like two people who had grown up speaking the same silent language. And in that fragile quiet, Thomas said something he rarely admitted. I don't know how to stop surviving, even now. Maggie turned toward him, something soft and brave rising in her chest. You don't have to. She didn't mean to touch his hand, but she did, and he didn't pull away. Later. She wouldn't remember who leaned in first. Only the moment just inches apart when the world stopped breathing. The wind held still. The stars watched, quiet and waiting. It wasn't a kiss. Not quite. But it was close enough that Maggie felt the warmth of his breath on her lips. Close enough to see the shift in his eyes, the hesitation, the fear. Then, like a light switch, he stepped back. Just a step. But it was enough to break whatever had formed between them. We should head back inside, he said softly, avoiding her gaze. Maggie nodded, though her chest was a riot of confusion. Neither of them spoke again for the rest of the evening. The days that followed were distant. Thomas buried himself in meetings. He returned messages through his assistant. He skipped lunch hours and left early from scheduled briefings. Maggie didn't push. She filled her time with policy notes, upcoming gala outlines, and reorganizing her inbox tasks that kept her eyes busy, even as her heart refused to settle. It wasn't just the near kiss, it was what it revealed, a shift, a line crossed, or maybe the terrifying thought a line she'd drawn herself, only to realize she didn't want it there anymore. Was she falling for a man who didn't know how to love gently, or was he pulling away because, for the first time, something had felt too real? One night, alone in her apartment, Maggie sat at the edge of her bed, laptop shut, tea gone cold beside her. She stared at the tiny dent on the spine of her favorite journal, the one she'd carried through college, and whispered into the silence, Did I mess this up? The city outside didn't answer, but deep in her chest, she knew the question wasn't just about him. It was about her, about whether she was brave enough to let someone see past her independence, past the armor she wore so well, and if she was wrong, if she'd misread everything. That kind of mistake could leave marks that didn't fade. But sometimes silence wasn't rejection. Sometimes it was someone else standing at their own edge, trying to find the courage to reach back. Some betrayals don't come with blood, just silence and a well-written memo. The day had started like any other. Coffee spilled on her sleeve during the subway rush, a stale bagel from the cart on Fifth, emails piling up before she even made it to her desk. Maggie Blake, 32, was used to chaos. She had learned to keep her head down, to breathe through the pressure, to find her center, even when the world spun around her. But nothing had prepared her for what she would discover that morning in the quiet of the 15th floor copy room, with the humming of a printer and the faint scent of toner in the air. It began as a routine task. Thomas had asked for an internal strategy file from last quarter, something buried in the executive shared drive, a maze of folders few dared to touch. She navigated with practiced speed. Budget reports, Q2 media prep, CEO comms, assets. Then she saw it. Humanity Project, Phase 2. She almost skipped it, but something in her gut whispered, open it. So she did. And within seconds, everything she thought she understood about her role, about him, began to unravel. The first slide was branded in Beckett Industries, blue and white, clean and clinical. But the words hit like a punch. Executive Image Rehabilitation, Phase 2 Emotional Accessibility Strategy. Below that, a photo of Thomas Beckett, arms crossed, eyes soft. The headline read, Repositioning the CEO as emotionally relatable through targeted association. And just beneath the image, there it was, her name, Maggie Blake, persona anchor. She blinked, her cursor hovered over the next slide, and clicked. The presentation, 42 slides in total, was a marketing playbook, meticulously crafted by external consultants and internal strategists. Slide 3 showed a mock-up of social content. Thomas walking beside Maggie, jackets off, laughing near a food truck. The caption, Leadership with a Human Touch. Slide 7, a summary of Maggie's public speaking tone, body language, media response score, her college history, her LinkedIn posts. Slide 14, projected emotional affiliation score. CEO plus Maggie Blake, plus 18% relatability perception among target demographics ages 45-65, female skewed. By slide 18, her stomach turned. There were call-outs for planned appearances where she was intentionally placed beside Thomas. Moments that felt natural to her spontaneous smiles. Quiet chats in the back of a conference hall were in fact scheduled, captured, and leveraged. None of it was accidental. None of it was real. Slide 29 shattered the last of her doubt. It was titled Past Implementation Benchmark, Hannah Crosswell, 2017 Rollout. She stared at the faded photograph of a young woman with chestnut hair and wide, trusting eyes. A former administrative coordinator. Hannah had been part of a near-identical campaign to soften Thomas's image before the IPO launch. The notes beneath were clinical. Campaign successful. Hannah transitioned to regional office post-campaign. No ongoing public association. No acknowledgement of her contribution. No trace of gratitude. Just discarded, replaced, forgotten. Maggie sat frozen for a long time, the screen's glow washing her face in cold light. Outside the copy room window, Manhattan buzzed with indifference cabs, honking, lives moving forward. Inside, something in her broke. Not loudly, not with rage, but with a silence so sharp it felt like glass cracking inside her chest. She wasn't just a secretary. She wasn't just a convenience. She was a strategy, a name on a slide, a prop in a story someone else wrote. And somehow, the man who had told her about his childhood, who had laughed with her on rooftops, who had once almost kissed her on a rainy night. He knew. Of course he knew. He was the CEO. She walked briskly to her desk, passing co-workers who smiled,
nodded, unaware of the earthquake inside her. She didn't speak, didn't cry, but her fingers trembled as she opened her laptop. To Thomas Beckett of Beckett in calm subject resignation body, I won't be anyone's brand, it's Maggie. She read it once, then hit send. There were no goodbyes, no last looks. She simply took her coat, stepped into the elevator, and left. Upstairs, in the quiet of his corner office, Thomas Beckett stared at his screen. Her message was only 12 words long, but it said more than any meeting, any press release, any televised charm offensive. He didn't move, didn't reach for the phone. Because she wasn't wrong. She was right, achingly, brutally right. And the worst part, he had let it happen. Maggie walked away with nothing but her name, but it was hers. And Thomas, for the first time in a very long time, didn't know how to fix what he had broken. You don't need to disappear to leave someone behind. Just stop showing up in their world. The building didn't look like much from the outside. A faded brick facade, paint peeling at the corners, a front door that creaked every time someone walked in or out. No receptionist, no security guard. Just a single sheet of paper taped to the wall beside the entrance Rise Center for Women and Futures. But inside, it felt alive. The kind of alive that came from laughter down the hallways, mismatched chairs, and half-full coffee mugs forgotten on tables during deep conversations. It smelled like old textbooks, dollar store lavender air freshener, and the sharp confidence of young women beginning to believe in themselves. Maggie Blake belonged here. She hadn't planned to stay long when she first showed up. She just needed something quiet, something real, something far away from elevators that smelled like steel and perfume and power. She'd found Rise through a friend of a friend, a small nonprofit teaching life and tech skills to young women who had grown up on the margins, foster care, group homes, shelters, the ones no one expected much from. Now she spent her days helping them craft resumes, build websites, present themselves in interviews, and, sometimes, on slower afternoons. She told them stories about failing forward, about rebuilding from nothing, about saying no, even when your voice shakes. They didn't know where she came from. Not really. Just that she'd worked in corporate and walked away. Some asked if she regretted it. She always smiled. No, she'd say softly, I only regret not leaving sooner. One Tuesday morning, while reviewing a presentation with a student named Kira, Maggie's phone buzzed with a name she hadn't seen in months. Emma Callahan, her best friend. The one person who had stood beside her even when everything crumbled. Maggie stepped outside to take the call. The Brooklyn breeze tousled her hair. I was wondering how long it'd take you to call me, Maggie teased. You're the one hiding in nonprofit world like some kind of storybook heroine, Emma shot back. Seriously, though. Are you okay? I'm fine, Maggie said, eyes scanning the street. Actually, I'm better than fine. There was a pause, a beat too long. What, Maggie asked. Emma sighed. I wasn't going to tell you, but you deserve to know. Maggie leaned against the railing. Know what he's been funding the center? Maggie's breath hitched. What, Thomas? Emma said. He made a private donation a month ago. Quiet. No name attached publicly. But the foundation records, he didn't even bother hiding it that well. Maggie closed her eyes. Emma continued. He didn't ask them to contact you. Didn't ask for meetings. Just signed the check, gave them a long-term pledge, and disappeared again. Silence stretched between them. Maggie's voice came soft. Why would he do that? Emma didn't answer right away. Then, gently. Because some people say sorry with actions, especially the ones who don't know how to say it out loud. That night, Maggie stayed at the center later than usual.
The students had gone home, the lights dimmed in the main room. She sat by the window, sipping lukewarm tea, her mind tangled in threads she hadn't pulled on in weeks. She'd tried so hard to move on. She laughed more now, slept better, woke without checking her email before her feet hit the floor. But still, there were moments when she missed the quiet tension in his voice, the way he'd glance sideways when he was thinking too hard, the way he had almost kissed her. She never told anyone how close they'd been. Not really. It was easier to pretend it had just been business, easier to rewrite the memory than admit how much it had meant. But now, knowing he hadn't let go completely, that he'd still tried to help her world, even from afar, made it harder to keep that distance intact. The next morning, Maggie arrived early to prep for the new intake group. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, and the streets were still quiet. Brooklyn had a different rhythm than Manhattan's, slower, softer, like a heart that had healed from something broken. She carried 2 coffees, one for her, one for Kira, and fumbled with the door key while balancing the cups. Something caught her eye across the street. A figure, still, alone. He didn't move, didn't wave, but she knew, even from this far away, even in the blur of morning fog and traffic lights, she knew that posture. The coat, the quiet way he occupied space without demanding it. Thomas Beckett, standing on the opposite sidewalk, watching from the shadows just long enough for her to see him. Just long enough to remind her he still carried the weight of what happened. And maybe still carried her, too. She didn't wave, didn't smile, just held his gaze, heart pounding. Some distances aren't measured in miles. They're measured in the courage it takes to cross the street. Sometimes the hardest truth is the one we owe ourselves. He didn't come with flowers, no bouquet in hand, no carefully rehearsed apology or sentimental card. Just him, coat slightly wrinkled from the subway, shoes damp from early spring drizzle, eyes darker than usual. Maggie met him in the front hall of the Rise Center. She didn't offer a smile. He didn't expect one. "I have 15 minutes before class," she said quietly, arms folded. "I won't take 16. Thomas replied. She led him to the small break room, folding chairs, a chipped kettle, a table cluttered with handouts about scholarships and childcare programs. A far cry from the sleek, glass-walled offices he ruled like a private kingdom. But today, Thomas Beckett didn't look like a king. He looked unguarded. He sat down across from her, folding his hands on the table, not controlling the room, just in it. Maggie waited. Let the silence stretch. He cleared his throat once, then again. But when he finally spoke, it wasn't polished. It wasn't clever. "I didn't come to fix anything," he said slowly. "I think that's what I used to do. Try to fix, control, reshape things until they made sense to me." He looked up, holding her eyes. "You didn't make sense to me." Maggie's breath caught, but she stayed still. "You didn't want anything from me. Not a raise, not influence. You looked me in the eye like I was just a man, not a position, and I didn't know how to be that." He paused, choosing his next words with care. "I let people build strategies around you. I let it happen because it made things easier. And when I realized it was hurting you, I didn't stop it fast enough." Maggie leaned back slightly, her heart beating in quiet protest. "Not fast enough," she echoed. "You didn't stop it at all." Thomas nodded once, slowly. "You're right. I didn't." He didn't flinch. He didn't justify. And that, more than anything, made her chest tighten. "You made me human again," he said, "and I didn't know what to do with that." The break room was quiet, except for the ticking of an old wall clock and the occasional voices of students echoing down the hall. Maggie looked at the man across from her, still powerful, still poised, but stripped of the shield he used to wear like skin. She thought of all the moments she'd played over in her mind, the laughter that hadn't been planned, the near kiss that wasn't strategy, the shared silences that spoke louder than rehearsed lines, and then the file, the slides, the feeling of being reduced to a tactic. Tears came slowly, not rushed, not dramatic, just one at first, then another. A warm, quiet release. But they weren't tears of pain this time. They were recognition, because for the first time, he wasn't trying to use her. He was simply trying to see her. "I didn't want to cry in front of you again," she whispered, swiping at her cheek. "I didn't come here to make you cry," he said, "but maybe it needed to happen. Maybe I did too." She shook her head, half laughing, half trembling. "You really are bad at apologies. I'm worse at goodbyes." That made her laugh soft, reluctant, real. For a long moment, they just sat there. Two people who had hurt and been hurt. Two people who had crossed a line, then drawn it again, not knowing where to go next. Then Maggie spoke, clear, steady. "I'm not coming back, Thomas." He didn't argue, didn't plead. "I know. But," she added, voice low but sure, "maybe we're not done either." His eyes lifted, searching. Hope flickered not in grand gestures, but in the stillness between words. "What does that mean?" he asked, not demanding, just wondering. Maggie smiled faintly. "I don't know yet, but I think, for once, we don't have to know." They stood at the same time. No handshake, no hug, just a quiet nod, and something unspoken left between them, not as distance, but as space, a space where something new could grow, if they were brave enough to water it. As Thomas turned to leave, Maggie returned to the classroom heartlighter, spine straighter. He'd spoken the truth, and she had, too. Sometimes, not going back was the beginning of going forward. Loving someone doesn't mean going back. Sometimes it means building something forward. The kettle whistled gently as the early morning light spilled across Maggie's kitchen counter, painting everything in soft gold. She stood barefoot on the cool tile floor, cradling a chipped mug in her hands. The air still carried the faint scent of yesterday's rain, and in the quiet hum of the city waking up, there was a kind of comfort she hadn't known in years. No meetings, no noise, just breath. 8 months had passed since she walked away from Beckett Industries. It should have felt like a lifetime. But somehow, the memories still brushed against her some mornings, like the ghost of a wind across her skin. She didn't regret leaving. Not for a second. But sometimes, especially in moments like these, she missed the version of herself that used to believe people in power could change not for optics, but from the inside out. And maybe she still believed it. A little. At the Rise Center, Maggie's days were filled with voices. Young women from all over Brooklyn poured into the vocational wing. She now managed carrying backpacks, toddlers, dreams stitched together with part-time jobs and late-night bus rides. Maggie didn't just teach them how to write resumes or navigate interviews. She taught them how to stand up straighter when the world tried to shrink them, how to speak in rooms that weren't made for them and make those rooms listen. Every small success hit her deeper than any corporate win ever had. When one of her students, Sharika, landed a full-time admin job with benefits, Maggie teared up in the hallway like a proud older sister. This was real work, not sleek PowerPoints, not image curation, people work. Across the East River, Thomas Beckett was walking a different road. He'd stepped down as CEO of Beckett Industries with a brief, controlled press release and a quiet, decisive exit. There was no scandal, no farewell tour. He simply let go. In the following months, he disappeared from headlines, but not from the world. Instead, he reemerged with a private foundation. The Beckett Initiative aimed at funding social impact ventures and nonprofit partnerships. He kept the name simple. He kept his presence quieter still. No gala dinners, no TV segments, just grants, site visits, and handwritten notes to every founder who received support. He visited community bakeries, re-entry programs, startup classrooms in church basements. He listened more than he spoke, and sometimes, in private boardrooms far from cameras, when people asked what changed his perspective, he would pause and then say, simply, "Someone I hurt made me human again." They hadn't seen each other since that last conversation. No calls, no messages, just space, but not distance, because their work kept crossing in small, silent ways. The Rise Center had received a grant from an unnamed donor 3 months ago, just enough to upgrade their computers and hire another counselor. Maggie didn't ask. She didn't need to. Sometimes gratitude didn't require an address. One late afternoon in May, Maggie stayed after hours to help a new intake group finish a budgeting project. When the last girl left with a fistful of job fair flyers, Maggie leaned back in her chair, rubbing the tension from her temples. She was tired, but it was the kind of tired that meant something. That same evening, a folder marked Community Summit, June, landed in her inbox. She clicked without thinking. It was a formal invitation from the New York Center for Social Change asking her to be the keynote speaker for an upcoming citywide summit titled Building with Kindness, A New Era of Leadership. She read the title again. Kindness. That word had carried so much weight in her life. And lately, it didn't sound soft anymore. It sounded brave. She kept reading. Date June 17th, location Midtown Convention Hall. Confirmed speakers: Maggie Blake, keynote; Dr.
Denise Howard, moderator; Councilwoman Jane Lim; Thomas Beckett, guest panelist. Her breath caught. There it was. Just a name on a list, but it stirred something. Not fear, not confusion, just something unfinished. That night, she couldn't sleep. She made tea at midnight, sat by the window, and let the city lights blur. The Maggie from a year ago would have avoided the event entirely. But the Maggie now, she wasn't hiding from her own story anymore, because she had built something without needing to prove anything to anyone, and so had he. Different paths. But maybe, just maybe, headed in the same direction. She folded the invitation and tucked it into her notebook. Across town, in a quiet brownstone office lit only by a desk lamp. Thomas did the same. Neither knew what would be said, but both knew it was time. Some moments don't need music, flowers, or a stage. Just two people, brave enough to begin again. The hall was quiet. Not silent, but quiet in the way that mattered. The kind of quiet where every word carried weight, where people leaned in, not out of politeness, but because something true was being said. Maggie stood on the stage, hands calm by her sides, the warm light softening the edge of her silhouette. She didn't use a script. She never did. Her voice was steady, low, but clear. I used to think the hardest part of life was failure, she said. That somehow if I could just work hard enough, learn fast enough, prove myself to enough people, I could outrun it. She paused, let her breath settle. But then I learned something harder than failure being used. The room didn't move, and harder still choosing to believe in people again. After that, a few nods in the audience. One woman wiped her eye with a napkin. Maggie smiled. Just a little. You see, dignity isn't loud.
It's not something people clap for. It's not trending. It doesn't always get recognized. But it's what keeps you whole when the world tries to carve you into pieces. Her gaze lifted toward the back of the room. Just for a second. I'm not standing here because I was lucky. I'm standing here because I kept showing up even when it was quiet, even when no one was watching. Applause came slowly at first, like rain starting on a rooftop. Then it built, honest and full, and somewhere behind it all, Maggie took a long breath in and let go of the last thread of needing to prove anything. Backstage was a rush of handshakes and thank yous, a blur of faces, old colleagues, young students, even Emma, who threw her arms around her. "That was perfect," Emma whispered. "That was you." Maggie smiled. "I almost didn't come." "You always do," Emma said, "when it matters." Then, through the hallway's crowd of well-wishers and staff, Maggie saw him. He wasn't wearing a suit, just a simple gray shirt, sleeves rolled, no tie. And on his face, not the guarded half-smile she remembered from boardrooms, not the camera-ready expression from PR playbooks, but something real, open. Thomas Beckett, leaning just slightly against the far wall, as if he knew she'd find him. And when she did, she didn't run. She walked, slow, steady, not like someone rushing toward a fairy tale, like someone walking toward the truth, finally ready to meet it. They stopped a breath apart. Neither of them spoke first. And yet, everything was already said. He looked at her not with regret, not with guilt, but with quiet knowing. And then, softly, simply, "I never stopped waiting." Maggie's eyes shimmered. She didn't need to ask what he meant. She'd known it the moment she saw her name on that invitation. She reached out, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, not for balance, not for drama. Just contact, human, warm. He stepped closer. And without another word, he leaned in, not quickly, not timidly, and kissed her. It wasn't for show. There were no cameras, no consultants, no angles, just a kiss, gentle, earnest, long overdue, and wholly, completely theirs, somewhere nearby. Emma turned away with a quiet grin. Across the room, a Rise Center alumna named Sharika snapped a photo of Maggie, thinking only of how proud she was to see her mentor that happy. And no one said a word to interrupt, because some reunions don't need narration. They just need two people brave enough to try again. Later that evening, when the lights dimmed and the crowd dispersed, Maggie and Thomas sat on the convention stairs, finishing cold coffee and passing a granola bar between them like teenagers on a school trip. They didn't talk about the past, not in detail. They didn't make promises or draw up plans. They just sat and let the stillness hold them. In the weeks that followed, their lives didn't fuse into one overnight. Thomas continued building the Beckett Initiative, funding ideas that might never get mainstream attention, but mattered anyway. Maggie stayed with the Rise Center, growing the program, mentoring students, rebuilding confidence hers and others. But now, sometimes, they met on Sundays, walked through quiet parks, talked about books, not business, shared dinners in old diners where nobody asked for selfies. And on one of those nights, as they lingered over pie, Maggie looked at him and said, "I don't want to go back." Thomas nodded. "We're not." And that was it. Not starting over, just beginning together. Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones no one sees. Maggie's story reminds us that strength isn't always loud, and that walking away doesn't mean giving up. It can mean choosing your dignity over your comfort, your peace over your paycheck, your truth over someone else's narrative. As we age, many of us carry quiet regrets, words we didn't say, boundaries we didn't set, parts of ourselves we put aside to fit into someone else's version of success. But it's never too late to choose differently.
to begin again, to believe that being honest, even when it's uncomfortable, is a kind of power. That kindness, when it's not for show, is a kind of revolution. And that sometimes healing doesn't come from being rescued, but from being seen. So whether you're at the beginning of a new chapter or deep into one you never expected, may this story remind you. You are allowed to rewrite your path. You are allowed to walk away and still find love, waiting, not in spite of who you are, but because of it. Thank you for spending your precious time with this story. If it touched your heart, even just a little, we'd be so grateful if you gave it a like, shared it with someone you care about, and subscribed to our channel. Every story we tell is made with heart, and your support helps us keep going one soul-stirring story at a time. From all of us at Shining Stories, thank you for listening. We'll see you in the next one.